It's nice to see so much interest for the topic, despite a lot of webinars happening these days. So that's great. The counting seems to be slowing, so maybe we should give it a go. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on the hot topic of legislation, deforestation, and supply chain due diligence. I'm Nicole Polsterer. I'm the Sustainable Consumption and Production Campaigner at Fern. Our topic today has attracted quite a crowd. As you can see, we are more than 200 people around this virtual table. And so for things to run smoothly, I would like to draw your attention to a few house rules. We have muted all participants for now, and unfortunately there's no chat room today because we have felt we are way too many to keep the chat manageable without distracting from our speakers' presentations. The question answer chat is, however, available. So if you wish to log a question, please use the Q&A chat. And please identify yourself clearly in the chat with your name and your organization's name. If your question has been retained, my colleague Daria will contact you to switch on your camera if you wish to do so and ask the question live. So with these few house rules, I would like to introduce our stellar panel today. We have 7 people, 7 speakers. Firstly, a warm welcome to the member of the European Parliament's Dilara Burkhardt, rapporteur of the first ever legislative own initiative report from the Environment Committee. In 2019, she has become the youngest German MEP, and she is a member of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Before this, she was vice president of the party's youth organization. As a next speaker, we will have Duncan Brack, co-author of a Fern Commission report on lessons learned from existing EU and French due diligence-based legislation. Duncan is an environmental policy analyst working on all issues we're interested in today, so including forest governance, deforestation, commodity supply chains, and the interaction between environmental regulation and international trade rules. He's an associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, and an associate of the Green Alliance. We then have the pleasure to welcome a practitioner, Pavla Zlavichkova. She's a specialist at the Forest Management Institute of the Czech Republic, which is also the competent authority for the EU timber regulation. She's also a member of the EU multi-stakeholder platform on protecting and restoring the world's forests. She has a background on sustainable forest management in the tropics. We will next welcome Jade Saunders, who is currently a senior policy analyst for forest trends in Washington, where she oversees the timber regulation enforcement exchange program, with a particular focus on the Asia-Pacific region. She's also an associate fellow at Chatham House, working on principles and practicalities of tackling deforestation through supply chain regulation. We are especially glad that we also have a representative today, Mr. Bart van de Wateren. He's the Vice President for Corporate Communications and Government Relations for Nestlé in the regions Europe, Middle East, and North Africa. Prior to joining Nestlé, Bart has worked with Belgian and international dairy trade associations, and he holds a master's in food science and food technology. Finally, our final former presenter will be Hugo Maria Schalli, Head of Unit for Multilateral Environmental Cooperation in the Directorate General Environment, representing the European Commission, whose legislative proposal for a framework to halt global deforestation is eagerly awaited for later this year. Last but not least, we welcome Saskia Osinker, co-founder of Fern and co-author with Duncan Brack of the report we will be discussing shortly. She will help us capture the discussion and give a commentary in the end. So without further ado, I would like to invite Member of the European Parliament, Dilara Burkhardt, whose legislative report on deforestation and supply chains was adopted with a qualified majority at the end of last year. So Dilara, welcome again, and we're very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm very happy that we have, that you as Fern have organized this webinar, which also is running under the banner of the Responsible Business Conduct Working Group of the European Parliament, where we as MEPs from different political groups, also different committees, work together to advance on legislation with regards to social and environmental company responsibility. And I must say, if there's one positive thing on the Corona situation, is that webinars become a more frequent thing, and hearings and workshops that would have been there in a very smaller situation in the parliament, where we don't have 200 people listening and also commenting on, asking questions on what we are doing, is a positive thing. Where I hope that we will stick to these digital tools to make policy making on the European scale more accessible and also more transparent in that. And I'm really happy to discuss today with familiar faces, because we have been in some webinars already. So as you can imagine, as MEPs working on these issues, we are quite busy at the moment. Just like last week, the European Parliament adopted the Voltas report on corporate due diligence, which also entails environmental due diligence requirements. And while requiring all companies that want to trade their goods on the European market to check their supply chains for human rights abuses and environmental damages will be a game changer to make globalization more sustainable and fairer, I would also like to point out an important difference between the proposal for a general human rights and environmental due diligence framework and a due diligence framework specifically aimed at forest risk commodities such as soy, beef, or palm oil. The general due diligence framework will most probably constitute obligations for due diligence as a continuous process of improvements within supply chains. I believe that the due diligence framework for forest risk commodities should go further than that, and also entail the clear possibility of market restrictions if sustainability criteria are not met. And this is as this is a high-risk sector with huge impacts on the world's climate, biodiversity, people's livelihoods, actually. It should constitute due diligence as a process that is undertaken before a product is permitted to be placed on the EU market to prove that it complies with certain sustainability criteria. Operators should be permitted to place forest and ecosystem risk commodities on the EU market only when they are able to demonstrate that there is at most negligible risk that the products did not originate from land obtained via the conversion of natural forest or other natural ecosystems, or undergoing degradation, and are not linked to violations of human rights. From this, you can already see that the European Parliament wants the scope from a regulation coming from the Commission, we also very much expecting to, is to be extended beyond the protection of forests only. Firstly, it also needs to protect other valuable ecosystems, because if we protect only forests, the pressure to expand agricultural land will be shifted on other land like savannas or swamplands. Just last week, a new Greenpeace research showed that the Brazilian Pantanal wetland is burned down for beef production, also for retailers and fast food chains in the EU. Secondly, the forest and ecosystem risk commodity supply chain law must also have a specific focus on human rights, in particular tenure rights and the rights of land and environmental defenders, as strengthening these rights will also strengthen the protection of forests and ecosystems. So I know, and I also saw and talked to a lot with Hugo Schali, I know that the European Commission is currently looking at different options, which is of course part of the good decision making. But I want to emphasize once more that the European Parliament has been very clear in its proposal to the Commission. The law needs to be based on mandatory due diligence, with the ultimate option of denying access to the market for commodities that don't comply with the due diligence and deforestation, ecosystem destruction, and human rights violations free requirement. And I know that the European Commission is sometimes referring to the EU timber regulations due diligence requirements and its problems. I'm very sure that we will talk about this also in this webinar. So I really want to emphasize that the European Parliament is fully aware of these problems, but we believe that we can learn from these problems and find ways actually to improve the requirements so that they will work. But the due diligence approach is still the right one. It is about reminding companies on their responsibilities for good business conduct, and it's about protecting human rights of the weakest in society and the preservation of nature. It is about shaping globalization in a fair and sustainable way. And it would also be a very strong signal to extend the Green Deal beyond European borders, especially ahead of the UN conference on biodiversity protection in Kunming or digital. We will see how this will work out. And also on climate protection in Glasgow. So we can be a world champion when it comes about sustainable supply chains. And I think that an ambitious proposal would be a good start for that. And looking forward to the discussion today. I would finish with that. Thank you again for inviting me.
Great, thank you. Dilara, I think your recommendations are very clear. I will now invite Duncan Bragg to the panel, who will do some of what you've asked, so look into lessons learned from the EU timber regulation. Duncan has a slightly longer time slot than other panelists. He has 15 minutes, and we would also be happy to take 2 questions of clarifications on concepts and if necessary, after Duncan's presentation. If you need to clarify some concepts, please ask a question in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address 2 of them after Duncan's presentation.
That's great. Thanks very much, Nicole. Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this. So I'm going to talk mainly about a report that I wrote together with Saskia, who's speaking later in the event, which was published by Fern back in October. We called it Enforcing Due Diligence Legislation Plus. You can find it on the Fern website. And the aim of the report was to look at try and reach conclusions for the enforceability of due diligence legislation, both in terms of its design and its implementation. Because an awful lot of the papers you see published about due diligence are about the principles, about why it's a good idea, and relatively few of them have gone into the real practical questions of how they can be implemented and enforced. Though I think we're seeing more of that at the moment. So this kind of discussion is very welcome, and we hoped to contribute to it in this report last October. We drew lessons from existing legislation, as Nicole said. And what we tried to do right at the beginning is to distinguish between the 2 types of due diligence approach. Now, in fact, Dilara already mentioned this anyway, and I suspect this audience is probably quite familiar with this, but quite often in a sort of more general audience, when people talk about due diligence, you're not quite sure always what they mean. And I think there are 2 broad approaches to due diligence. Both of them incorporate the kind of due diligence process. So the requirement to scrutinize your supply chains, to assess the risk of the presence of whatever the criteria you're worried about, whether it's human rights abuses or environmental harm or child labor or whatever else, to take risk mitigation actions to reduce the risk of exposure, and then to communicate what you're doing and to provide remediation for any damage that's been caused. So both of them incorporate that idea, but how they fit into a legislative framework is a bit different. And the first kind is what we call the broad corporate due diligence requirement, or a continuous process of improvement, such as we see in the French devoir de vigilance law and the UN guiding principles. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide. It's not specific to any commodity or sector, and it's not linked to putting products on the market. Whereas the second one is, again, Dilara said this, a more product-specific or market-specific requirement of due diligence, a requirement for placing on the market. And we see this kind of legislation in the EU timber regulation, also the EU conflict minerals regulation, though that's only just come into force, so we don't really have any evidence of how it's been implemented yet. And also legislation in the UK and my country to deal with the legality of forest risk commodities, and that's being designed at the moment. And we tried to draw lessons from the implementation of those kind of legislation. So let's look at the first one most, the broad corporate obligation of due diligence. I said this is based very heavily on the UN guiding principles and OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, and also on the French devoir de vigilance law. And of course, the UN guiding principles and the due diligence guidance were essentially, they're not written as legislation to be enforced by competent authorities. They're written as kind of best practice guidance for companies. And there are some issues about translating that into legislation that can be enforced. But you'll be familiar with what they're trying to achieve. Companies are supposed to take a risk-based approach to the problems, however you define the problems, and to deal with the kind of highest risks first, and then to work their way through them. They're not expected to be able to solve all the problems instantly. And why we call this a continuous process of improvement, that's the aim of the due diligence process. It's supposed to stimulate a continuous process of improvement where the companies work with their suppliers to resolve problems. If they find they really can't resolve the problems, they should disengage from their suppliers. But that is seen very much as a matter of last resort. You try and resolve the problems with them first. So that can make judging a company's performance quite difficult, because when you scrutinize a company's supply chains and you find problems with human rights or environmental harm, it's not always clear whether that's because the company is trying to resolve them and hasn't managed to do so yet, or because the company is just actually not really doing anything about it. It's not impossible to do. And indeed, the organization Shift published a really interesting report, which I'd recommend to you just last month, which looked at a number of criteria for judging whether a company was seriously engaging with this problem. They called it the Signals of Seriousness. And it included things like what framework the company had set up to deal with human rights problems. It was talking about human rights due diligence, whether it had adopted targets, whether it was engaging with stakeholders and so on. So it's not impossible, but it's not a very straightforward thing to do either. So the lessons we drew from looking at this and from the French legislation is that the obligations must be very clearly defined. That's not perhaps so difficult for human rights, where you pretty much know what you're talking about in terms of the international human rights instruments, but the term environmental harm, which you see in the French legislation, that's a bit looser, and there's no real equivalent, there's no environmental equivalent of the UN human rights instruments. So you need to be very clear about your criteria. Transparency obviously is an essential element. And what you're getting at here, what you need to know about is the degree of risk of infraction of human rights or environmental harm or whatever the criteria is in company supply chains and companies' actions in addressing it. And unless you really know all that, it's difficult to enforce this legislation properly. So you can see, although it's a very good outline, I think a very good approach in principle, it is quite tricky to enforce. However, there are ways to enforce it, and these are our recommendations for what might come out of the DG Justice process, which is looking, as we understand it, at this kind of legislation. And these are the kind of obligations that we recommended should be in there. So first of all, obviously, the basic obligation of exercising due diligence for the risks of human rights and environmental harms throughout a company's operations and supply chains. Not product specific or sector specific, but it could be accompanied with guidance for specific sectors, because of course the exact mix of human rights problems and environmental harms is different for each product in each sector. Now, as I said, it can be difficult to judge whether a company is far enough along that road in exercising due diligence, whether it's how far it's gone down the continuous process of improvement. So there are a number of other kind of metrics that we recommended could be judged by by legislation and enforced. So the obvious one is that the company has to have in place a system. And we think the legislation should specify a standard, the minimum standards for those for that system, and it could be possibly third-party audited in the same way that due diligence systems are to be third-party audited in the conflict minerals regulation. The activities that the company is undergoing obviously need to be monitored. You need to be clear whether it's actually doing anything to implement its system, and it needs to be monitored by a government enforcement agency. It shouldn't be left to NGOs or other stakeholders to raise problems like it is in the French law. the company should be able to demonstrate some kind of progress in this continuous process of improvement. Perhaps the European Commission, the legislative body, could specify or set out a number of benchmarks, the kind of thing that was addressed in the Shift paper, the kind of things that you expect companies to be doing in implementing a due diligence system. And if you don't do that, if you just say, well, you have to have a system, and you don't look at how it's implemented, there is a risk of just box sticking by the company and inaction. There should be a requirement to publish a report on the company's due diligence system and its activities in implementing it. That's pretty straightforward, and it is there in the French legislation. And also, there should be an obligation on the company to the companies that are covered by the legislation to create grievance and early alert and complaints and remediation systems. And there should be a role for governments here as well. There might be a role for a pan-EU contact point for stakeholders believing that they are suffering from companies' failures to implement their obligations. And finally, there should be provisions for civil liability. That is a hugely controversial issue, so I won't say any more about it. Perhaps we'll get into that in the discussions. Okay, so that's the first kind, the kind of broad corporate obligation of due diligence requirement that stems from the UN guiding principles. Now, the second kind, and I guess we might talk about this a bit more in this seminar, but both forms of due diligence are important, and there's no reason, I think, why both of them can't be brought in, and they can overlap and reinforce each other in useful ways. But the second type is the product-specific and market-related due diligence that we see in the EU timber regulation, as said in the conflict minerals regulation, and also being designed at the moment in the forthcoming UK legislation. So what were the lessons we drew from the implementation, primarily of the timber regulation, because that's where we have the expertise, the evidence. And it's pretty clear that the timber regulation has drawbacks, but it has had clear positive impacts. And I'd refer you here to a report published by Forest Trends, just I think last week, which is really interesting, based on a survey and interviews with a large number of timber companies. And what we've seen is that the introduction of the timber regulation has led to much greater scrutiny of supply chains, far more information collected about the source and what's going on at the source. There's been more purchasing of certified timber, and companies have been prepared to pay higher prices as well, and also FLEGT licensed timber for Indonesia, the only country where we have a licensing system. Some companies have changed their source countries to eliminate, to stop sourcing from high-risk areas. Many of them have changed suppliers for the same reason, and some have changed the kind of timber species they source to avoid high-risk species. And this is exactly the kind of thing you would expect this kind of due diligence legislation to lead to. Now, there are problems with it as well, and I expect we'll get into those later, but they are good positive impacts so far. However, obtaining reliable evidence of breaches of due diligence or proof of legality or sustainability is always likely to be difficult. The timber regulation is based on the legality of production, and it relates to a number of criteria like legal access, legal rights to harvest the forest, the ways in which the forest have been harvested, protection of biodiversity, protection of high conservation value areas, and so on and so on. And it is not straightforward to get evidence of whether those criteria have been complied with. Usually, you rely on documentation from enforcement agencies in the country of origin, and that's not always at all easy to get hold of. And this is particularly true for the prohibition which accompanies the timber regulation. Companies are not allowed to put on or are prohibited from putting on the EU market timber that's been purchased illegally. So it's not just a due diligence system, it's a prohibition on placing illegal timber on the market as well. And there are good reasons for doing that, but it is extremely difficult to link any particular consignment of timber that's put on the EU market to a specific illegal act that happened in the country of origin. And in fact, we've seen no enforcement cases at all so far under the prohibition. All the enforcement is done has been on the basis of whether companies had exercised due diligence or not, or had a good due diligence system in place. So I said lots of documentation has been collected on the timber that the companies are sourcing, but it's not always clear how reliable or how useful this is. Yeah, ideally, independently verified evidence. Evidence could be independently verified, not relying on documentation or agencies in the country of origin is ideal. And for anything forest related, of course, we have the possibility there of using satellite imaging for deforestation, the extent of deforestation. And that's becoming much more readily available now and much more high resolution. So I think that is a good something to be built into this kind of legislation. There might be the possibility also of other kinds of independently verifiable criteria, evidence rather, perhaps community-based monitoring of human rights abuses or land tenure. And I think that's quite an interesting area. We don't really talk about that in the report, but that would be an interesting area to explore. We drew lessons from the timber regulation that the due diligence obligation should not be restricted to first places. The timber regulation, the obligations are only restricted to the companies who first place timber products on the EU market. Traders further down the supply chain only have obligations of collecting information on who they source from and who they sell to. And the problem with that is because we see uneven enforcement efforts throughout the EU between different member states, that we've seen some companies set up as first placers in member states where they know enforcement is weak, and then they just sell on to the real first placers later on in the supply chain. And if they're caught, these kind of shell companies don't really have any assets. So if they are caught doing something wrong, they just close down and there's no particular loss. So it's too easy to get around that problem. Both because the combination of the restriction in the enforcement to first places and the substantial variation in enforcement efforts between member states. So both of those act to make the regulation less effective than it should be. So our recommendations drawing on that, and this is possibly what might come out of the DG Environment process, which I'm sure Hugo will talk about a bit later, is that if we're going to have product-specific market-related due diligence, we think there is a role for this, then the obligations on companies should be, first of all, if you're going to introduce a prohibition, and that can be a very powerful instrument, but only if you can back it up with evidence. So a prohibition should be limited to criteria that can be credibly verified. And I think, again, the most obvious thing there is the extent of deforestation, which you can verify from satellite imaging. So you're not reliant on evidence and documentary evidence from the country of origin. You could put a wider range of criteria into a due diligence obligation in the same way as the timber regulation does. And what you're really expecting companies to do there is to establish a framework to address these criteria and reduce the risk of sourcing forest risk commodities with risks of deforestation or human rights abuses or whatever you define the criteria to be. And the basic obligation is to make sure the company sets up a decent framework to do that, rather than assuming that every individual product can be free of problems. And as I said, for some of the wider range of criteria where it's more difficult to get evidence of whether they've been complied with or not, then setting up a due diligence framework is probably better than the prohibition. There is the question then of whether you establish due diligence as defense against liability. And it wasn't quite clear, actually, on the very good report that Dilara Burkhart's committee came up with. It does talk about having whether the company has exercised due care in its obligations as a defense against liability. And it wasn't quite clear whether that phrase due care meant the same as the due diligence obligations that the report sets out in more detail. But you can see the logic behind it. If the company has set up a decent system and it's doing its best to implement it, then that should be a defense against the liability if it's found nevertheless to be putting on the market commodities that don't meet the criteria. But obviously, on the other side of that, there is a clear danger that a company might simply set up a system and then not really implementing it properly, and therefore you don't really, it's just a tick box exercise, and you're not really trying to do what you should do. It's an excuse for inaction. So we kind of left that question open in the report. We floated the idea of a possible requirement for an import declaration. So forcing companies to accompany products put on the EU market with information about how they've been sourced, whether they've been sourced without deforestation, without human rights abuses, whatever. And then that opens up another line of possible enforcement. It requires companies to scrutinize their supply chains genuinely, so no getting around just by saying, well, we've got a due diligence system in place. You have to say, we know this about these products and we're stating it. And if it's found to be inaccurate, that opens up another possible line of enforcement. And this is taken from the experience of enforcing the Lacey Act in the United States, where the import declaration requirement is one of the more commonly used basis for enforcement action. And then just to finish, both approaches I think both due diligence approaches have value. Clearly, the earlier one is much more wide-ranging across a company's entire operations and supply chains. The second one is more specifically focused on particular commodities and placing on the market. But both of them face a number of similar challenges about enforcement practicalities. And so what I'm saying on this slide applies to both of them. Clearly, obligations and criteria must be as clearly defined as possible. The company has to know what it has to do. And that has been a bit of a problem in implementing, both the French law and the EU timber regulation. We believe the due diligence obligation should extend throughout the supply chain. They should not be limited just to first places. But there may be the possibility of, as I understand the Dutch child labour due diligence legislation works, where a company has to either carry out due diligence itself, or it has to obtain evidence from the company it's sourcing from that that company has carried out due diligence. So you're not assuming every small business right at the end of the supply chain has to do a full due diligence framework. Certification, the various certification we see for timber and for lots of agricultural commodities, it's helpful, but the systems by and large aren't robust enough to prove that they're compliant with the criteria you put in legislation. So they shouldn't be seen as proof of compliance by themselves. Enforcement should be a task primarily for government agencies. We shouldn't rely on NGOs or other organizations to bring cases before the courts. It should be government agencies monitoring what companies are doing. And to enforce the law effectively, to enable those agencies to do their job, requires systematic monitoring of companies' performance based on reports, investigations, and other sources of information. Now, we do think the substantiated concerns route that the timber regulation has, whereby NGOs or other stakeholders can report concerns to enforcement agencies, that's a useful thing and that should be retained. But it should be the government's responsibility to monitor the company's performance. Now, obviously, that's a really big task, and we've seen how big in the timber regulation, because there are an awful lot of companies dealing with timber. But you do it on a risk-based approach, and you look at where companies are sourcing from, and you do the highest risk ones first, and lessons that can be drawn from enforcing the legislation then apply to other companies. Companies know what's happening to other companies. Clearly, enforcement agencies need adequate resources. This does seem to be okay in some member states, and other member states are clearly not providing enough resources. And the agencies need adequate enforcement powers and penalties, including we recommend the powers to issue injunctions against sales and to confiscate products. By and large, the timber regulations being enforced by just applying or being companies being penalized by being fined. And that's too easy to build into the normal costs of doing business. You need to be able to take the products off the market and to confiscate them. And as much as possible, we know this isn't an EU area of competence, but as much as possible, the penalties should be similar between member states. It would be useful if it's possible to bring cases before specialist courts who are familiar with these kind of issues. And we have had a problem in some member states of courts just not really understanding how due diligence frameworks are designed to work, not thinking that environmental issues are a big problem. That's a sort of broader issue. But in some member states, it works quite well because they have courts who tend to deal with just these issues or related ones. And it's important, obviously, that the enforcement agencies have access to data, primarily from customs. That's been a problem in some member states, but it should be possible to resolve. And then the final point is that enforcement agencies should be encouraged to collaborate with other member states' authorities. Obviously, that makes sense. And that goes on with the timber regulation and with enforcement agencies outside the EU. And the TREE network, Timber Regulation Enforcement Exchange, that Jade helps to run, set up by Forest Trends, is a really good kind of forum to make this kind of enforcement better. So that's a really quick run through of what we said in the study. There are other more detailed points that I haven't had time to look at. So I'd recommend the study to you. It may have been overtaken by events slightly, but I think much of what it says is relevant. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Duncan, for giving a tour of the options. There's already a lot of activity in the chat. I would suggest we keep some of them for the discussion later on. They go beyond clarification of concepts, but I would like to highlight one question that was in the chat, whether such due diligence-based legislation should and could also apply to the financial sector. Duncan.
Yes, I think so. In principle, I'm not an expert in the financial sector, and the question of how investments are made raises slightly different questions from what we've been talking about flows of products. But I think the general principle of due diligence framework, that you scrutinize your investments and you make sure they're free of the criteria you're worried about, I think that certainly applies. I think you'd have to think through quite carefully how it would work in practice. But yes, in principle, yes.
Great, thank you, Duncan. I also want to highlight that we probably have a global witness among the participants who are working on that topic, so maybe they could take the floor later on in the discussion. With this, as we're slightly trailing behind our schedule, I would like to invite Pavla Zlavichkova from the Czech Competent Authority to give her views and lessons learned from the EU implementation of the EU timber regulation and what we could learn from it for a new regulation. Pavla, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the floor. Thank you, Fern, for organizing this event and for opportunity. Let me share my experiences in public here. So I have spent some time in Peruvian Amazon doing research on biodiversity, and during that time I have experienced a pretty bad case of deforestation related with violations on locals. And therefore, I am glad there is such an increasing effort for tackling deforestation. However, for a couple of years right now, I'm also competent authority here in Czech Republic for EUTR, working on Forestry Management Institute. And like according to that, I have experiences from this point of view I would like to share with you. Briefly, I would like to speak about the EUTR in a nutshell. I'm pretty sure you all are aware of this topic, and about the due diligence system and its implementation in practice, and some speech from my personal view on implementation on its. Also, there is some possible solutions and some recommendations for this. So as you all, of course, know, the placing on the market of illegally harvested timber or timber products derived from such products shall be prohibited, as says in EUTR regulation. Operators shall exercise due diligence, and part of it is information of trader, origin of location, but the important is assurance of compliance with applicable legislation. And itself, the DDS is a set of measures and procedures that are adequately to minimize effectively that risk. Actually, I would like to share here some issues we are facing within the implementation. And from my personal point of view, there are pretty huge gaps within the due diligence systems, as is set in EUTR. The biggest issue we are facing is corruption. Why corruption? Because the DDS is always based on documentation. The first question concerning the documentation is what type of documentation? Because whole world concerning the forestry sector has really different kind of implemented legislation in place, different systems, and each country has completely different attitude and approach for this topic. There are, of course, some country overviews. There are 11 of them made by UNEP WCMC, which are somehow describing what is needed for complying with the EUTR, but the others has to be somehow found out by competent authorities and of course by operators themselves. So first, the barrier we are facing is language, because usually these systems are made in national languages. It means that we are facing a huge bunch of documentation in national languages such as Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, and so on, and many others. And if you want to examine the due diligence, as we are obliged to as a competent authority, we have to really be oriented within all these documentation, as well as operators have to be. So it's really, you can imagine it's really time consuming, and it's not really easy for us, yes. The other point is how to verify authenticity of this documentation, because there is no uniform, no global database of tools for verifications, or there is no database for example, national points to contact for verification in particular countries. So then, for example, if you have some import from one particular country, you have to check what is the legislation there, what kind of documentation is needed, and then you have to go there and see who is a governmental organization issuing the documentation, try to just keep in touch with them and to rely on their reply. If they don't, then there is no enforcement for this kind of process. And if they do reply, there is again actually the issue with the corruption, because if they reply all documentation is according to the law, then there is always this has to be some level of trust, because there is always the issue with the countries with high level of corruption. So then we are getting to the point of the negligible risk, because the operators are obliged to do the procedures and measures which are adequate to minimize effectively the risk to the negligible level. And always there is a question, what does that mean in the particular cases? Because there is always different understanding of this definition, and always there is something different for competent authority, for operator, for supplier, for prosecutors, what this kind of negligible risk is. Because there is always some documentation attached to the imports, and then there is a question, the assessment of it, and yeah. So then there is set in the EUTR regulation that if not sure that the negligible risk is on place, then there can be the third-party verification. For example, in our cases within the Czech, we experience quite many type of verification and certification, but the most common one is like a chain of custody certification verification. And we always face the issue that, to my knowledge, within these we have checked. There were no, for example, GIS bases, or there were not even like tracing up volumes up and downstream, sometimes not even species. So then as competent authorities, it's hard to assume that if there is a certification on place, if the risk then is negligible. And I have to say that we have same issues with the this verification documents as with the state document, is if it's again from the country of origin with a high level of corruption. So also there is an issue that sometimes there are no available information on time. So we have open inspection, there is inspection ongoing, and I check on the verification page that certification is valid. But in the same time, there can be some issues, some problems, and it can end up in a suspension of certification or verification, and we are not aware of it in the time of inspection, so we can end up in the wrongdoing on the end. So also there are some issues that there are no verification schemes in place in some particular countries. For example, Myanmar nowadays, a pretty huge issue, and so on. The other point, and the last one from this, from my point of view, it's illegal timber, because it's operators are not are obliged not to place the illegal timber on market EU. It's then hard to prove. We are always facing the issue that we never can prove actually is illegal timber, or if there is some suspicion, it's always ending up by just not sufficient due diligence, because there is always some documentation, sometimes a lot of documentation, and then we are getting back to the first points I've already mentioned here. So this is the main challenges we are facing from my point of view as a competent authority. And there are some food for thought, that if we are considered that timber is solid, huge material, and we are facing huge challenge to trace it back to stem, of course, there are some laboratory methods, DNA, isotopic ones, but they have their limits, still quite huge limits. So then how hard it will be for oil, cocoa, and beef. It has to be considered the mechanism pretty well for this kind of commodities. And also, it's not that operators don't have will. They, within my checks I've done, they always have will to fulfill requirements, but they always ask how to mitigate the risk to negligible level. And this is something which is not uniform. It's not something it can be said in general, because it depends case by case, volume by volumes, by species, by everything, by the country of origin. And it's really hard to answer this question actually as a competent authority. What's the negligible risk? Then it's a question always of the cost. So who will pay for it? Of operators, because usually if there has to be negligible risk, it's a really extreme burden for small and middle-sized companies. And this is something I think it was been said many times already. And the huge topic is illegal, the gray zone, because the ones who wants to operate in gray zone intentionally, they are always some steps ahead. So they just work on virtual offices, and they are not even catchable from our point of view. And it's this gray zone, it's very hard for us. It's more for police than for us, yeah. So just one thought, that from my point of view, there should be bigger cooperation between EU and producer countries to work somehow effective on these topics I was saying previously. So thank you for attention, and if there are some questions, I'm really happy to answer if I know the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavla. Thank you very much for drawing attention to issues that exist with existing legislation in the actual drafting of it and then the implementation. We will now call Jade to present her research on how to mitigate some of the issues you have mentioned with access to data and what companies should make publicly available or not. So Jade, please share your wealth of information with us here.
Thank you. Hi, thank you very much. My name's Jade Saunders. I think you've been introduced to me. Oh, hang on, I need to change my view. Daria, would you be able to go on to the next slide for me? Because it's just the arrows have disappeared randomly. I think I might be on the wrong view. Okay, so I have worked with the enforcement officials for the EU timber regulation for many years. Since 2012, I started preparing for EUTR implementation workshops. So lots of what Pavla has just described has been the territory that I have worked on throughout the last few years, and many of the challenges that she described are really very real and reflected across the member states, and certainly in the UK, where the EUTR has become the UKTR. So I'm not going to suggest that there are easy solutions to any of those things. There really aren't any of those challenges. They're very profound challenges. However, I think, as Dilara said at the beginning, hopefully the way that we can approach all of this is to learn from those challenges and to come up with regulations that are stronger, more enforceable, clearer for companies and for competent authorities, so that we can have a positive impact on deforestation in agricultural supply chains. So one of the things that I have been looking into in relation to the UK's proposed requirement or obligation on companies to establish due diligence for forest risk commodities is the possibility of reporting, so a kind of public reporting dimension. So, and given that that's one of the things that the Commission is also exploring in terms of the possible legislative options, regulatory options, we thought it was worth me adding this to the general discussion. Next slide, please. When I talk about reporting, I am only talking about what I think should be made public. So this is not reporting between the companies and the competent authorities. This is about a kind of a public set of information that allows civil society, investors, other groups with an interest in what companies are up to hold them to account and to understand the footprint of these companies in tropical forest and other vulnerable ecosystem areas. So I'm going to quickly break this down into what I think are the three kind of component parts of a reporting regime. And I have taken this from, well, the kind of main points of inspiration for this have been the UK Modern Slavery Act, which is a complete disaster in terms of reporting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that probably later on if I've got time. And AFI, which is a framework for a voluntary framework for reporting on deforestation, deforestation risk policies in agricultural supply chains. So I'm going to quickly describe system-based reporting, the implementation kind of elements of reporting, and then supply-based reporting. So to group the kind of different metrics that could be reported under those three things, and then talk a little bit about the accountability gap. And then critically, I think, integration with other initiatives, because you don't want to force companies to create reports which just sit on a website. I mean, this is one of the critical things that's happened with the Modern Slavery Act is, you know, a report is published, it sits on a website, the information doesn't go anywhere, it's not used by anyone else, and it's not meaningful, essentially. Okay, next slide, please. So system-based reporting is, what's your company policy, which presumably that standard is going to be set by legislation, but it's been the sort of the baseline kind of reporting thing. What tasks and information have been identified as critical under that policy, which team is responsible for them, and what internal management arrangements are in place to implement them, e.g. do you report to the board, you know, that kind of thing. All of those things are interesting, but when you think about it as an outsider, trying to hold this, an investor or a civil society organization trying to hold that company to account, actually this gives you very, very little to work with. If this is all you know about what that company is doing, you have no way of judging whether or not any of this is meaningful or just a fig leaf. So it's all good stuff to report, but it's not going to get you anywhere serious in terms of holding that company to account. Next slide, please. The next level down in terms of kind of the nitty-gritty of making these reports meaningful, making them actually, you know, creating a set of data that's actionable, could be about implementation. So this is how many supply chains or contracts have been subject to due diligence checks, how many supplier engagement workshops and meetings have been held, what percentage of company purchases have been subject to full traceability, whether that's physical separation or mass balance or batch-based, what percentage of your supply chains are certified, how many suppliers have been rejected or subject to third-party audit, how many complaints have been received from, you know, communities who are affected by your supply chains. Again, all really good stuff to be reporting on, but still actually quite hard to hold those companies to account, because this is all aggregated at this point. So you know that 473 complaints have been received, but you don't necessarily know where they're from or what they were or how the company has reacted to them or any of those things. So again, it's like it's not that these are bad things to be reporting, but once again, this is not enough for consumers, civil society groups, or investors to genuinely hold companies to account. Next slide, please. So the next level down, and this speaks to Luciana's, Moessa de Souza's point about, well, it's fine to reference satellite imagery, but if you don't know where the companies are buying, how do you make that link between the company that you're trying to hold to account and the area of forest that you're looking at through, through a satellite in the sky? So the next level down is supply-based reporting. How much of each commodity has been purchased? When was it purchased? Where was it purchased from? What is the land use change history in that area? I mean, arguably people can, other people can, once you've got that kind of, no, that's not traceability, but once you've got that link between the regulated company and the forest area, you could be putting those together and drawing your own conclusions about the land use change history using satellite imagery. But what's the land use change history? Are contiguous or related areas being monitored in real time or volumes? Because you can be in a situation where you're sourcing from a particular farm. That farm was legally converted, but what's happening on the border of that farm? What's happening in the national park 3 miles away from that farm? Has the volume on that farm been consistent over time, or did they suddenly start producing a load more of that product in a way that suggests that actually they might be pulling in something from another land? Okay, so are contiguous areas, yeah. So how is that company effectively screening for future deforestation around the supply base? Which specific suppliers have been subject to engagement? This means who's been talked to about these problems, what kind of scrutiny, named interventions with particular supply chains, particular tier, the kind of known tier 2, 3 type suppliers that have kind of are subject to NGO exposés and that kind of thing. So I think this is the level where many companies would feel extremely uncomfortable presenting this stuff, and all sorts of concerns about commercial confidentiality would be in play. But actually this is the level of detail. Sorry, my dog is helpfully whining in the back of the room. But this is the level of detail that really would need to be put in the public domain in order for consumers, civil society groups, or investors, or any other interested party to do anything with it. And one of the things we've really seen with the EU timber regulation is the absence of public information, meaningful public information, means that the regulation is not credible. People, even where the regulation is changing corporate behavior, corporate sourcing, and there is evidence of that, as Duncan referred to the paper that we put out the other day. There's another paper, more detailed paper, which is currently going through some peer review and will be out in about a month, which has some more statistics on, it's all self-reported information. It's an imperfect methodology, it's an imperfect selection of companies, but nonetheless it's indicative of the kinds of changes that have been made in response to the EU timber regulation. The absence of that information in the public domain means that civil society groups consider that very little has changed often. Competent authorities are kind of under attack, even where they are doing their best to implement and enforce these extremely kind of complex pieces of law, as Pavla has sort of so eloquently pointed out. So I think there's going to be a lot of resistance if the option of requiring public reporting is taken in Europe. It is part of the UK proposal at the moment, so it's likely to be taken in the UK, but there's going to be a lot of resistance to the level of reporting which would actually make it worth having a reporting regime. And again, I point those of you who are interested towards the Modern Slavery Act if you want to see what happens when you create a transparency requirement without this kind of detail in it, which is a completely pointless bureaucratic exercise. Next slide. Okay, UK Modern Slavery Act, lessons learned as described. I don't know, I'm assuming that everybody knows the Modern Slavery Act. Essentially, there is one element of it deals with global supply chains, and companies are required to have a report which is signed by a board member, put on their company website, which says how they are dealing with slavery in their supply chains. So literally you could write a report saying we have slavery in our supply chains and we don't care, and publish that, get a board member to sign it and stick it on your website somewhere visible, and you would be compliant with the UK Modern Slavery Act transparency in supply chains TISC requirements, which is fairly dreadful. Scope for independent audit of reports. This is a really interesting area. If you are going to require public reporting, do you, as a government regulator, if you require the companies to, do you as a government regulator want to validate anything that's in those reports? Or is it fine that companies are simply putting reports out? Or do you want to allow for third-party verification of those reports? And if so, how should that be achieved without conflict of interest in those arrangements? So if you're going to say, the regulator will accredit a set of auditors who can audit the reports to say, yes, this is a legitimate set of data arising from company A's supply chains before it can be made public or whatever. There's some interesting, again, I imagine that there's some lessons to be learned there from the monitoring organization arrangements for the EU timber regulation. And I think also from RED directives where there is the possibility of independent verification, independent audit of reports. I think it's going to be critical that that auditors are accredited to be auditors, and that they can be held to account for rubber stamping dodgy reports, essentially. Sorry, the sun has come out after the most gruesome day and my camera's struggling with it. And then how to make this outsourcing of enforcement is credible, consistent, and cost effective. I think that's going to be the critical lesson that can be learned from the monitoring organisations from the EU timber regulation. Next slide, please. And then we have integration with other initiatives. So how does, I mean, this has been pointed to by Duncan. How do you avoid the possibility that a kind of publicly reported system-based reporting becomes your kind of defense against being found legally, being found in the courts to have been involved in supply chains which have profound environmental or human rights harms associated with them? How do you, is it a defense against civil accountability, particularly given that there is this member state patchwork at the moment and this DG Justice proposal emerging, but which may take a little while to be bottomed out and implemented. The other areas, as I've sort of flagged, relate to financial sort of investor responsibilities, investor due diligence, and investor disclosure. I think it's really important that whatever metrics are made public are based on standards that can be sucked in by financial institutions into their risk systems and into their own reporting under these emerging standards. Now, I don't think, it's really tricky using carbon accounting to capture the kind of consequences of deforestation for agriculture, because you have one horrendous year of clearing the forest, and after that you're just a farmer, you're buying off farmed land, so the carbon metrics don't look too bad. But it's important to try to think through how to make this stuff work within a mandatory TCFD framework. I think the TNFD, the kind of nature-based reporting is coming down the pike, but it's going to be quite a few years before that's in any kind of clear framework for reporting, and certainly any kind of mandatory framework for reporting. So I think that's kind of one area that I'm doing more analysis on at the moment. And then this EU Sustainable Finance and Disclosure Regulation, which looks like a brilliant initiative to try and avoid greenwash, again, is going to be a really important important sort of framework for understanding and reporting on these issues. And I think it's important to be thinking through requirements on companies to generate data which will be consistent with those frameworks too. So I think that is it. I can't remember that there was another slide. Next slide. No, there we go. Final slide. Okay, thanks very much. I'm very happy to take questions on this, and also to comment on the other piece which Duncan presented, which is drawn from lots of Forest Trends work as well.
Great, thanks. Yes, indeed. And sorry about the technical glitch. I see most have recovered. We are missing about 40 people. Well, I guess only the toughest get through. So thanks for reconnecting, and I'm giving the floor straight to Bart, who will enlighten us on how such a big and complex company like Nestle is actually carrying out due diligence already, and what it would expect of a new legislation.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, and good afternoon. So maybe just a few words first where I am. So you said I'm part of the executive team of Nestle in this region. So there is many kind of preconceptions of what is being discussed in these boardrooms. What I can tell you is that we are indeed discussing a lot about growth and growing of the business. But that growth is crucial to sustain. But at the same time, we also take the vision that not all growth is acceptable. And only growth that really thinks about the human needs, but also don't overshoot the planetary boundaries is what we really need. And this is where your role also as civil society, as policymakers, many of you are participating, is to challenge us, to continue to challenge us. You do that certainly very well, but also to set the right conditions, the conditions to enable that kind of growth that is acceptable for humans and for the planet is prioritized. And deforestation is an example where this needs to happen. And I believe 10 years ago, we started on this journey, made a clear commitment, zero deforestation. We are now, for our key commodities, at 90%, 90% verified. And we should go to completely the 100% in 2 years from here, more or less. This last 10% is really the toughest thing, and it's not only about the 10%; it's also keeping the full 100%, because that's sometimes forgotten. It looks like it's a stable figure once you have achieved it, and that can only be done. And this is the next slide. Is really when you have a responsible sourcing standard, and you would say, and I heard it saying, maybe it's a piece of paper. Yes, but it starts at least with a piece of paper where you outline what you really expect from your suppliers. And we have many, 165,000 suppliers Nestle has in the world. So that's, they all have this paper basically with our requirements. And I highlighted here on the slide what we have on deforestation. You see, you recognize those things, so no need to put them orally. But what I would say, if they don't respect, we engage with them. We suspend them in the first place. We start to engage. We look into improvement plan. If the improvement plan cannot be done within a period, and you see here the 6 months, unfortunately, the suppliers will be excluded from our supply chain. So to make it happen, you need tools, and to make this paper alive, you need the tools. And these tools are on the next slide. Some of them have already been mentioned. And if we can move to the next slide, you will see them. There is a combination of tools basically to achieve this. We call this the toolkit approach. So first of all, mapping. Jade, you were referring to it, many others, mapping where we are, where we have everything in place. Certification is part of the problem. It's highly contested sometimes, and we saw reports earlier in the week on that. We believe it's one of the tools. It's certainly not the only one. If it's being used, it should be considered, but certainly not an excuse not to do due diligence. Satellite monitoring, different opinions on the panel, but for us it was a major step forward when we started to introduce it some 2 years ago. On the ground verification to go there with our partners as well to check what's going on and to fight the problem. And collaboration, Consumer Goods Forum, Tropical Forest Alliance, these are our partners that we are working with and that we believe we can address things more holistically than just in our own supply chain. Then let's look maybe at palm oil to illustrate where we are. It's quite an interesting slide, the next one, really to look at where we were 10 years ago. Basically, I have to admit we were nowhere. We had no traceability beyond tier 1. There was no understanding of the issues. There was no collaboration on the ground, no collective actions. This was 2010. Now, with all the tools I spelled you out on the previous slide, we are end of 2020. We are for palm oil. I mentioned you the 90%. For palm oil, we are 70%. Deforestation-free. You see also the numbers of traceability. And basically, for palm oil, we have worked with 85 direct suppliers and 1,600 mills that are behind this in 21 countries. So that's the kind of complexity of our supply chain just for palm oil, not to speak about cocoa or other things that we have in place. What we have seen is that we could probably have done better. But the real issue is that if we would have done better than this 70%, we would have given up the risky parts and most of the time the smallholders. And it's there where we believe as a big company, notably, we need to fight the problem. We need to work together. Otherwise, it's kind of a surrender. And what will happen is that these risky parts, they will go to other kinds of supply chains, maybe not ending up in Europe, maybe not ending up with companies that want to tackle the issue. And this, I really appreciated in the Fern report that it was also highlighted that you don't want this. And I think that is actually the key point. We need to progress step by step, but we also need to make sure we solve the issues and we don't just exit from the difficult issues. And this brings me to Jade's point on transparency, and that's on the next slide. Jade, you will see there is a lot of things that you referred to already. Progress reporting, disclosure of the tier 1s of the 15 raw materials. This covers 95% of what Nestlé uses. List also of suspended suppliers, here in this case palm oil, KPIs, the definitions that we are using, all these kind of reports. Also, we will have our TCFD report later on in the year as well that we will publish. For us, transparency is really key. If we don't have this transparency, we cannot act. We can also not collaborate with others. And this is where I align with you. This needs to be legislated and mandated, this kind of disclosure. What is fundamental, nevertheless, is really that everyone feels comfortable to disclose. And that this is not just used against you, but is used for a solution, for a purpose. And that comes to your accountability point. Disproportionate kind of measures where this will lead to fights in the courtroom instead of solving really the tricky issues, will lead to people that maybe will be subject to transparency, but they will not be transparent in the end, or they will just exit the difficult parts of the supply chain. So this is crucial for me, that we strike the right balance in EU legislation here. don't take it as a threat. It's really a reality check from the ground, how we move the difficult parts into deforestation-free, and that's very important. So to conclude, just a few considerations for the legislation, and these are just a few because there is so much more to say. We did, I believe, a good paper with Tropical Forest Alliance, with also a number of NGOs here around the table and 50 or more companies that says, okay, mandatory due diligence, great tool, but it needs much more, partnerships, dialogues, all these kind of elements that are on the slide. So that's very clear. Secondly, we have a lot of good practices already, definitions that we are using. They are there on the slides. Let's leverage them. Let's use them also in legislation, because they work. They have proven to work in our experience to get already to the 90% deforestation free. Then when you go and think about products versus bulk and how you legislate that, bulk commodities, go for commodities, because ultimately this will lead to the right results for the products. And commodities is really what we trade and what we buy and use. Then I come back to the principle of continuous improvement. You've seen over these 10 years what a journey, but more to come in the next years. Continuous improvement is good, and in the legislation you can say it's good. But it should be clear that every company should basically set a timeline in its due diligence process to become 100% deforestation free. I stress the deforestation here because the tools that I've shown you before, they make us confident actually that we can reach basically close to the 100% deforestation free, and that's very important. And I believe this should be the ambition of some of the guidelines or the direction in the legislation. And finally, I repeat the point that is key for us, incentivizes, challenges to be fully transparent, to collaborate on the ground in the different landscapes, and not only in our supply chain itself, but we should only be held really liable for our own actions, and making sure we do the due diligence beyond, work together and go to this 100% like we are close, and that will get us somewhere, and happy to further discuss how we can do this together.
Bart, thank you very much for sharing these recommendations and thoughts. Looking at my watch, I'm getting slightly concerned. But yeah, we have our final speaker, Hugo Maria Schale from the European Commission, who will give an indication of what the current fitness check of the EU timber regulation and FLEGT regulation could indicate for a new forest with commodity specific regulation, and what some of the thinking is in the current impact assessment that is going on for the new legislation. Hugo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. It's amazing looking at my co-panelists, but also looking at the list of participants, with how many of the participants I have over the last years interacted personally and have had dealings, be it in the context of public consultations, in the work on FLEGT PPAs, in the implementation of the EU timber regulation. So it's, I assume, when I take it that this is really an expert panel and an expert range of participants in the debate. And I think that a lot of the essential arguments and facts have been put on the table in the very enlightening discussions that I've heard this afternoon, looking at it from a company perspective, with Bart looking at it from a civil society, academic, and a national competent authority perspective. Of course, all that starting from the forceful political message that the Parliament had sent by the adoption of the Burkhardt report. And I think that even before the Burkhardt report, the Commission had made it very clear that we were going to take initiative. So in a way, the European Parliament walked through a door that was already wide open. So I think we are in a very dynamic and interesting policy context. And I think that the focus of our webinar this afternoon is actually interesting because it is actually one of the few events that looks back at the experiences that we've made with the existing instruments. And whereas most, and I think Duncan referred to that, most of the webinars look at great principles and all the good things that we will do ahead. So I think I will sort of make a fairly concise presentation, and I think there are questions might follow on that, and I hope it works. Okay, yeah, sorry. So the starting point, of course, is we need to learn from past experience. And the main past experience in that regard is the overall implementation of the EU Flagged Action Plan and its two main instruments, which is the EU Timber Regulation and the Flag Regulation. And of course, both have to be seen in the policy context of the early 2000s and on the, I would say, the definition of policy priorities and political priorities of the Commission at the time and the way the problem was seen at that point in time, namely that at that time, the major driver and the main problem was identified as commercial logging. And therefore, the focus was on timber trade. And of course, even then, when we did the impact assessment on the EU timber regulation, it was clear that international trade in timber and derived product was, when you look at overall sizes of the markets and of the economies, was a fairly marginal issue economically. That, of course, is radically different when you talk about the proposal that is in the making, which deals with a broad range of agricultural commodities. I think we go into a different ballpark figure. Now, we have over the last year conducted a fitness check of the two related regulations, one of them being demand side, which is EUTR, and one of them being supply side, which is flag regulation and the flag VPAs. And I think that definitely when I look back at the contribution that was made by the colleague from the national competent authorities, I think that she has actually very eloquently lined out what are the challenges in regard of the implementation of the EUTR. And I think that we all agree, and the results of the fitness check will bear that out, that there has been a positive result with regard to incentivizing companies to keeping supply chains clear. However, we have come across a number of major challenges, which is that infractions under the EUTR are difficult to prove and substantiate in court, which undermines its dissuasive power. And I think that is one main complaint that the member states' competent authorities have. We're dealing with complex supply chains with a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises, which leads to high costs for companies, perhaps too high in that regard. We're still checking on that. That when you look at the situation over the years, the imports of timber from some high-risk countries where we can be fairly sure that there is a good proportion of illegal timber involved has actually increased. And I think that is a problem because here we see companies on the one hand trying to invest in clean supply chains, while on the other hand, due to some of the inconsistencies and challenges, some illegal timber continues to flow with all the negative consequences on unfair competition and on price. So I think that that is very clear. What is the way forward, which we probably will look at? Improve the due diligence complemented by other measures. I think that the issue is, of course, to repair some of the deficiencies that have been, I think, described by others. I think the concept of non-negligible risk is an issue. I think we have a major issue with the distinction between operators and traders, and also an issue on a sort of overall the reliance on legality in that regard. And I think that I have to point out, I mean, historical reference, some of the difficulties that we have now have been added in the course of the co-legislation procedure when member states and some political groups in the parliament actually said, well, this is all too difficult for European operators. This is all too difficult on forest governance systems in member states. And that's all too complex for companies. So we need to limit the obligations. And the results we see as now. Now, on the FLEGT regulation, I think that we need to make the distinction of what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I think that the positive story of the FLEGT VPAs is that where we have VPA processes, we see positive results in terms of enhanced stakeholder participation in policy making at the national level, improvements in forest governance and administration, and some enforcement. However, when we look at, and I think it's not surprising because we're dealing with illegal logging, there is no hard evidence that VPAs have contributed to reducing illegal logging in partner countries or the consumption of illegally harvested wood in the EU. That's partially due to the fact that since 2005, when we started with that regulation, only one country out of the 15 with whom we have engaged has an operating licensing system in place. And when you look at the overall trade pattern, only one VPA country is among the top 10 EU trading partners, which is Indonesia again. So I think that from our perspective, the part that we are not confident has made its proof is the licensing system and the timber legality assurance system in partner countries. Now, we need to now to look, and that sort of flows a little bit in the discussion of what we're doing, to determine whether the system of the FLEGT regulation fits into a system that will be based on sustainability rather than on legality. I think we'll come to that fundamental distinction in a moment. And I think that one thing that we absolutely need under all costs to be maintained is the support mechanism to enable partner countries to comply with requirements without the elements that do not work. So on the one hand, perhaps we may want to reflect in terms of an enhanced use of the forest partnerships that DG INPA is preparing without the elements which, in our view, do not work, the timber legality assurance system and the licensing. Now, I think I can go over that slide relatively quickly because we've heard about that. But I think, again, it's hard to find detailed information. The term negligible or non-negligible risk is subjective. The legal system in the member states very often have no clear understanding and no long-standing tradition in dealing with the concept of due diligence, which I have to say in most member states is seen as a concept coming out of common law and not really being central to Roman law approaches. And I think that is something that we need to deal with. We have seen some member states where this has almost paralyzed prosecution and enforcement and made it really hard to apply any sanctions to governments in question. And I think FLEGT regulation, I think I've spoken about the challenges before. Now, this, as you know, is part and parcel of the process of following up the 2019 communication. Just as a reminder, what is the problem and what are the drivers, which is clear that we need to deal with agricultural production and agricultural expansion, and we actually need to move from a system that rewards effort and announcement to a system that rewards performance and effect. And I think that's the main challenge that we will have. Now, the objective is, of course, in two general objectives. We want to reduce our contribution to global deforestation and forest degradation and thereby making a contribution to reducing deforestation at global level. So it's really on us, but also what will we contribute? And we will have 4 specific objectives: minimize the risk of placing in the market, make sure consumers and citizens are aware of the impact, thereby promote the demand for and consumption of commodities and products that are not associated with deforestation and forest degradation, which means market opportunities for those who are willing to make the transition, problems for those who want to keep stuck in old ways, and since I think there is an issue, thereby also want to incentivize investment and financial interest in sustainable production systems. Now, moving on, what is it that really are the cornerstones of what we are working on? One is deforestation-free criteria, including forest degradation, which needs to be based on solid science, which needs to build on existing international use definitions and criteria, which must be non-discriminatory, meaning covering also production and in the EU, and needs to be implementable and monitorable. I think it's important in practice. So what are the sources? The sources are the FAO definition of deforestation, modified to actually repair the problem that we have, that it actually would allow plantations. Maybe taking some elements for flexibility based on national policy that comes from UNFCCC and REDD+, looking at issues on the range of UNFCCC plus the high carbon stock approach, and a cutoff date to be determined. I mean, the EP has in its report said no later than 2015. And so that gives us as a range between 2015 and 2020. And we will have to make the determination on the basis of, do we have the data to monitor and quantify? I think that's a clear choice that still remains to be made. Then we need to look at what is covered, commodities and derived products. And Bart, I'm sorry, the train is moving in a different direction. We definitely want to look at covering also derived products. And I'll talk about the justification for that in a minute. So I think that what we've looked at is a preliminary list of commodities, which include beef, wood, palm oil, soy, rubber, cereals, cocoa, coffee. We're still looking at a couple of others. But looking at the massive problem that we have, we had to say, okay, in our conceptual approach, do we go for something that fixes a limited scope of products for now? Do we go for a system that starts with a limited list of commodities and derived product and devises a mechanism for expanding that? Or do we say any product that may have any kind of impact on deforestation and forest degradation is covered as of now? Now, our sort of our preference, I think it's more manageable, goes towards something which we would call progressive. So what was the methodology for the choice of commodities and products? I think it's we reviewed literature and available data on commodities with the highest global contribution to deforestation, first set. Second, refine the selection process based on EU market power, which means what do we consume? And then look at a method for selecting derived products to be included based on a cost impact analysis. Now, the juicy part, which we haven't yet worked on, derived product can be of two kinds. Derived products can contain commodities that are linked to deforestation, forest degradation, or they can be produced with them. And I think it's all clear to you what I'm referring to. So I think that's clearly a sort of a final choice to be made. Now, options for policy measures, and I'm sure that you've seen a variance of that slide in many subsequent webinars and conferences. We had 20 options, and in the end, what really crystallizes is whatever we do, in the end, a variant of due diligence is what works best, because with all stakeholders, we can actually build on experiences that they have with implementing due diligence requirements. Now, the problem is that the raw due diligence that we had in EUTR has shown us that that is overburdening both competent authorities and economic operators. So we really feel that this needs to be complemented by some benchmarkings country assessments, possibly also by a system of mandatory public certification, by which we would mean a system by which public certification systems in third countries and EU member states would be recognized. And that would mean we would arrive at a tiered system of due diligence with more requirements for some and less requirements for others, depending on the fact whether there is certification, mandatory public certification, or benchmarking. Now, there is also the option of combining due diligence with mandatory labeling. That is an option, although I would say, given that any of those options would most likely be combined with a general prohibition, such as in the EUTR, it doesn't feel very cost-effective and cost-efficient to us at this point in time. Now, option 5 is what I would call a nuclear option, because that's a very linear application of the IUU system to trade in agricultural commodities, which I think is very challenging. We're still applying it, assessing it, but I think that probably whatever we do, an element of due diligence will be important. I think that's all I had to say at this point in time. What I would say is that, of course, as I said earlier at the beginning of my presentation, we will need to assess against the experiences with EUTR and FLEGT what will happen to this framework, because it's very clear. We're moving from legality to sustainability. So, and we cannot have a dual system, and there would not be added value in a dual system for legality on the one hand and sustainability on the other hand. So that's a decision still to be made. I think that it is presenting us with another challenge. The EU once again is racing ahead of the pack. I mean, others are still focusing on reporting, on legality, on transparency, on accountability. We will propose to go one step further. Now, I know that it's always a challenge for the EU when we promote a new concept when the rest of the world has just adapted to what we have spearheaded 10 years ago. So I think we're used to that, and I think we'll have to stand the flak that we probably will get from all corners, saying, "Why don't you keep yourself to legality? It's worked so nicely." The problem is it hasn't worked so nicely, and it hasn't had the effect that we wanted to have. And I think I'm looking forward to the debate this afternoon, but also I think we will have, once we come out with the proposal, we will have a very robust debates with the Council, with the European Parliament, and with other stakeholders. And I think that all the issues will come to the fore. And what I've heard this afternoon from my co-panelists, and also we're looking at the questions, I'm pretty sure that all that debates will be very lively. And I'll take away a lot of things from the from the interventions and the written contributions that I've seen and heard. Thank you very much, Nicole.
Great. Thank you, Hugo, for these very clear words and giving us an idea of what the direction of travel is. I think with your presentation, you've already answered some of the questions in the chat. There was a question about what signal would it send to Brazil or other countries if this was, again, about legality. You made it clear it's about sustainability. There was a question by Guillermo from Brazil who cannot take the floor, so I will help him and ask his question. And it was, how would this legislation apply to the Cerrado? You have made it clear in your presentation that you're looking at the FAO forest definitions, which, as far as I know, would not include dry forest in the Cerrado. Could you maybe explain again this choice and why not go for accountability framework initiatives, definition of deforestation and ecosystems? And then the next question will go to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to see all of you here. So my question was in the first instance for Pavla, but it also has a spin-off for Hugo. So the question for Pavla was at the end of your presentation, you said that you thought there would be important synergies between any kind of due diligence regulation for forest risk commodities and voluntary partnership agreements with the producer countries in question. And so what I wanted to ask you was, as a competent authority, as a member of the EUTR flagged expert group of competent authorities, to what extent do you already see synergies between the flagged VPAs, both those that have been implemented and those that are still in progress, and implementation of the EUTR? And the spin-off for Hugo is that I have been a bit surprised to see in the summaries of the fitness check of the two regulations, the claim that, as I understand it, there really are very few such synergies, in the sense that the VPAs neither reduce the risk of illegal logging entering the EU market, nor do they contribute to a better flow of information to the competent authorities enforcing the EUTR. And so that doesn't fit with my own research-based understanding of how things have worked. And so I'm interested to hear both from Pavla how she perceives it, but also Hugo, from you, whether perhaps I'm misunderstanding the slides that I've seen both today and from the EUTR expert group papers summarizing the interim findings of the fitness check. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Hugo, over to you for 2 questions.
Thank you. We have to balance ambition with implementability. And I think that the choice that we are proposing to make is go for implementability. And if we were to apply the regulation that we will propose to all fragile ecosystems, we would necessarily have to weaken the sanctions and the obligation that we place on operators. So we have to make a choice at some point in time, and we will motivate that choice, obviously. I think that I see a very useful interplay between the DG Just initiative on horizontal corporate sustainable governance and ours, that the DG Just initiative, which most likely will be a directive, by the way, is something that can cover a wide variety of environmental and social impacts against the obligation of improving company and corporate systems. And that's where the transparency and accountability aspect comes in to a large extent. And that will also allow greater coverage. Now, we did receive in the context of the European Green Deal a very specific mandate, which is to look at something measurable, implementable with regard to deforestation and forest degradation, which I think is very clear. So I think we will, and we are working with the colleagues from DG Just hand in glove, try to put forward a system that really shows the interconnections between the two in that regard. So I think that it's going to be very exciting, but I mean, you will see the outcome of it. On Jonathan, what I said was that both regulations have had a definitely positive impact on market transparency and on the transparency with regard to companies' actions and their supply chains. But we were not able to gather a lot of statistical and quantifiable information on the impact on the volume of traded timber that is of legal origin into the EU and in the EU, and secondly, on the impact on illegal logging in third countries. So I think you gave your understanding of what I said. It was very useful that have the possibility to clarify what I understood I said. If it was clear, I think then that is that. I'm not sure, Nicole, did I address the questions or have I omitted an element?
About the forest definition or the Cerrado definition?
Well, that I addressed.
Then Pavla, would you like to come in and?
Thank you for the poll. Actually, I would just clarify what I meant by the negotiations, and the VPA was with a question mark. Actually, from my point of view of as a competent authority, what I meant was that for us would be maybe more helpful, it's just suggestion, that if there is a negotiation on the government level. What I meant was that for example, my chair, from my point of view, if I want to verify some documentation, for example, from even you mentioned Brazil, of course, I contact the authorities there and I try to verify it. However, it always depends on some will of the verifying authority or even other authorities in other countries. And sometimes if they don't reply, we are with this kind of verification of the due diligence scheme itself a little bit toothless. That's what I meant, that from my point of view, there would be maybe more efficient if there is negotiation on this huge topic more between the countries than light on the operators and competent authorities. Hope it's clear.
Great, thanks. Yes,
Thank
I think it is clear. I'm looking at the time there, and I see the final panelist participant coming up, Michael, with a question to the panel.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Nicole. I did have a question for Ms. Zlavichkova around some of the challenges in enforcing the EUTR due diligence framework. But I wonder, I'm just going to sneakily squeeze in, a question just to Mr. Shally. Just in his response, I think he said, focusing on implementability. Yes, right there with you that any framework needs to be able to be implemented in practice. But you mentioned that you wouldn't be able to extend the framework to include other ecosystems without weakening the requirements and sanctions on operators. And I wonder if you could, it seems quite a leap to make, so I'm just wondering if you could explain why that would be the necessary outcome, or why that would lead to a weakening in requirements and sanctions. And my question, if I can double up, for Ms. Zlavichkova, I'm not an expert on the EUTR, but it seems like a lot of the challenges you listed in checking the legitimacy and the reliability of evidence would generally indicate that an operator relying on that evidence wouldn't be able to make a very reliable assessment of the risk of illegality, or that their products comply with the EUTR's requirement. So I'm just wondering, if a competent authority themselves can't make the reliable assessment of risk, wouldn't that also indicate that operators themselves can't make that judgment, and therefore couldn't really demonstrate that they're complying with the EUTR's requirements? Thanks very much, Nicole.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Pavla, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you for the question. Actually, it's a good question. And this is something I've also mentioned, that this is about the negligible risk. And sometimes I just find out, and it's for us, it's not negligible risk. But for example, by the assessment of operator, the negligible risk was done. So this is what I actually mentioned on the first time, that sometimes there is this issue that I state that this is not negligible risk, and the operator state otherwise. And after all, then start this negotiation even with operators, with the countries of origin and so on. So I hope I have answered this question. I can clarify it more if needed. Thank you.
Would somebody else from the panelists like to make a final comment on this question? No? Then I apologize to the other participants who have fielded questions, and unfortunately, due to lack of time, we cannot address them live now. We will see whether we can field them to the panelists after this discussion and answer them in writing. I would now like to ask Saskia Osinka to share her view on our discussion and make a small commentary.
Thank you, Nicole. That's a big task because it was a very rich discussion and it was a very rich set of presentations. When Duncan and I did that report about due diligence, we basically had lots of questions ourselves, which we also didn't answer in the report. And that's why the report clearly spells out that a lot of thinking needs to be done still. And I think it's probably good to just remind everybody that this due diligence discussion is actually really new. Some of us might feel that we've been in for decades, but actually the UN guiding principles are only from 2011. And all the other regulations are much beyond, from much later. So we've actually only been discussing this for 10 years. So there are still a lot of lessons to learn. And I think there will continue a lot of lessons to learn. And we should continue to learn those lessons when we go through with this whole process now. It's a new concept. It's a new development. But there were a lot of lessons mentioned by the different presentations. I just want to highlight 6 which came across very clearly. The first one is that certification can be an important tool, but it can never be a tool for compliance. And I think that's what the new regulation should take into account as well. The second one is that the penalties are currently too low and that injunctions and confiscation of materials could be a really important tool, which maybe should be enhanced in a new regulation. The third one was that harmonization across member states is very, very problematic. I just want to refer everybody to a report by Forrest Trent, which looks at teak from Burma, which clearly shows that, you know, when you want to get it imported into the EU, you can. And Hugo Maria Schalli mentioned also that he even said it had increased illegal timber imports. That's another problem, of course. If you had more harmonization across member states, that wouldn't be so much a problem. The fourth one is to don't restrict it to the first place operators, the first place the timber on the market, or in this case, the agricultural commodities on the market. You need to sort of go through the whole supply chain. The fifth one is don't depend on documentation. Pavla made that really clear. She said it's all about corruption. The documentation doesn't work and we are inundated with documentation. So go beyond documentation and look at other data, including satellite images like from Airbus and the Starlink program and things like that. And the last one is the one Jade sort of went into in great detail about, basically requiring improved reporting. And Jade gave a lot of detail about what sort of reporting is useful in that regard and what sort of reporting is less useful, which is also very important, I think, to take into account of this new proposal. And Nestle made the point, you know, transparency is important. They do it already, a lot of that reporting. So there is a lot to be built on and to be worked on to move forward on that. So that's all about the enforceability, and the enforceability is really important. But of course, only once we really know the content of the DG Environment Regulation, but also of the DG Justice Directive, we can really start looking into much more depth how this really could be enforced. We heard from Dalara that deforestation and other ecosystems should be the content of the regulation, and that sustainability should be a bit element, and human rights and tenure rights should be part of it too. We heard from Hugo that he's probably only going to focus on deforestation and sustainability. So what that means in practice will have a lot of implications for the enforceability of the regulation, how that is going to be defined. So we need to really look into much more detail when that comes out, how that is going to work. I heard Hugo say that we need to have solid science and we need to go with existing definitions. And then he mentioned the FAO definitions, and I can't see how the FAO definitions go hand in hand with solid science, because we all know that the FAO definitions are purely political and nothing to do with solid science. So we have a problem there. And the other thing which didn't really was discussed very much today was the liability of companies and the possible impact of a cutoff date. So once we have the content of these regulations, including what it says about liability or what it doesn't say about liability for companies and what it does say or what it doesn't say about the cutoff date, and how you potentially could sort of remediate negative impacts achieved before the cutoff date, we need to really sort of look again at the whole enforcement questions. And then two more points, because I know we are running out of time. We talked mainly about the DG Environment proposal here, but of course there is the DG Justice proposal, which was mentioned. There's also the talks about cocoa going on, which all should be sort of linked together. And of course, there's a discussion which Jade mentioned about the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the new non-financial reporting directive, all of which should be linked in this whole mix together as well, because only once we have the full picture, we can really understand how these initiatives are building on each other and how they really are going to sort of supporting each other rather than undermining each other. So again, looking at enforcement, once we have all those different initiatives on the table, is really, really important. And then last but not least, we all know that deforestation is, as scientists say, a wicked problem, cannot be easily solved. It's really complicated, it's very complex. It hasn't got any sort of direct solutions. And I think it's really important once we have this packet of regulations and directives that we really look at to what extent are they or are they not addressing the root causes of deforestation, with consumption being one of them. And I was very happy to hear Bart from Nestlé to mention that we need to push the companies on the consumption level and on the growth, because we can't continue keeping growing consumption and production within a finite planet. We all know that, but we don't really give enough attention to that. So the whole circular economy should be coming back in that as well. And the other sort of element of the root cause is, of course, the governance and the rights aspect. I don't think we spend enough time talking about tenure rights. As Duncan and I write in that report, you know, if you look at the concessions, agricultural concessions, a latest research said of 73,000 concessions in 8 countries, 93% overlap with indigenous peoples and customary tenure rights. So when you're talking about agriculture and concessions, you par definitions talk about violation of tenure rights. And when you have developing a regulation on deforestation, you have to look at tenure rights. You cannot sort of ignore that. So which of the regulators is going to do that and how they're going to do it is really, really critical. And if the regulations cannot do any of these root causes addressing, like the consumption level or the rights level, then we need to have mitigating measures or other policies that do that very clearly. And I just want still to highlight the fact that the voluntary guidance on the governance of tenure, which most countries on the planet have signed on to, is something that has to be implemented by countries to really address these root causes of deforestation, and that should really be supported by the EU through the forest partnerships or through any other means. And maybe a last point, as one of the people who have been very active in this sort of VPA discussions from the beginning, when I hear Hugo say that we haven't seen enough impact of the volumes of trades from the VPA, then I can take that point. But I think it's really important to look at why haven't we seen that? And I think one of the reasons why we haven't seen that is that it is an incredibly complex problem with corruption at the heart of it. So how are you going to tackle that? So any new initiative is something that we really need to ask ourselves before we can really sort of come up with initiatives that are actually going to be more effective. And I think there's a lot more to say. There's tons more to say on this whole topic, but this is not an end discussion anyway, because I think only once we have the legislative proposals, we can really start having a real discussion again on the whole impact of the enforcement of these possible proposals. But so I'll leave it at that, Nicole.
Thank you very much. This was already an overwhelming summary. Thanks a lot. I see Duncan has one final comment and an addition to make. Is that correct?
Yes, thanks very much. Also just wanted to pass on apologies from Jade, who texted me to say her Wi-Fi had cut out and she was sorry to miss the end of the discussion. I just wanted to make the point, I think Bart touched on this actually, and it's relevant to what Saskia just said. We've been talking about due diligence, obviously, but the impact of due diligence legislation will be much greater if it's not done in isolation. I think it would be much stronger if it's reinforced by a whole bunch of other things you need to do. For example, the kind of partnership agreements we see in the VPAs or something like that. Public procurement policy, consumption policy. I mean, one of the main drivers of palm oil consumption in the EU is demand for biofuels, for example. All these things can be addressed. If you forget about all those and just look at due diligence, you won't achieve all the impacts you want.
Thank you, Duncan. Everybody's nodding. There's a shared understanding of this, which is great. So again, thank you, panelists who are still here, for your time and sharing your expertise today. Thank you to participants for fielding excellent questions. We will be trying to get back to you and get answers from you from the experts here on the panel. I apologize again for the technical glitch. I think we know now what to do next time. And yeah, thanks for staying tuned and for bearing with us in this exciting journey towards new legislation. Thanks a lot and goodbye.
It's a shame we didn't have another hour. I thought it was a really good event though, thanks.
A lot to discuss, yeah.